Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 178, part 3 of Hollywood, The Tipping Point.
From all of your research and just with Billy the Kid and Doc Scurlock, why do we do this? Why do we elevate these kind of bad dudes? Why do we elevate them?
I have a quote for you from my favourite writer of all time, Hunter S. Thompson. In a nation of frightened dullards, there's always a sorry shortage of outlaws, and those few who make the grade are always welcome.
If you haven't already, please listen to part 1 and 2 in the Hollywood series, available in your feed right now. Otherwise, here's a quick recap. Scott Scurlock moved to Olympia, Washington in the late 1970s. He enrolled at Evergreen State College as a pre-med student, but at some point, he pivoted away from medicine and a, quote, traditional lifestyle, becoming an underground meth dealer instead.
I'd heard a rumor or two about that, that he was making money off from meth and that they were out in the woods and trailers and things.
Scott rented a house that had 19 acres of property, which included a stand of old-growth cedar trees, and he began to build an epic treehouse.
Now, remember, this is like 60 feet off the ground, and then there's a bathroom, which you walk the plank over to another tree area, and there's a toilet and a mirror and a sink with the pipes going down, again, like a Dr. Seuss thing. And I remember going out there, and it's like, oh my God. And then you're worried because you get a little, self-conscious. You're sitting there, in all God's glory. No one's around there. Unless there's a helicopter.
Scott's magnanimous personality and sexy, live at the edge of your seat, zest for life, intoxicated the many women he brought to his treehouse sanctuary.
He had it going on. He had a nice smile. He was very affable, easygoing, very easy to talk to, made you feel special. He had that kind of quality to him.
However, everything would change in the late 1980s when Scott's friend and drug dealer was murdered. The reality of the life he was leading, of selling meth, left him vowing to quit the drug business forever. He was absolutely terrified that he could be in danger. And he still had those 5-gallon buckets of cash he'd buried around his property. But that wouldn't last forever.
I know he traveled a lot. He would go to Hawaii a lot. He mentioned the Seychelles, Europe. I think he may have, I'm just speculating, but probably spent it as fast as he got it.
In August of 1988, the movie Young Guns came out in theaters. It was the age of renting movies at Blockbuster, and Scott was known to watch the movie over and over again.
William H. Bonney, also known as Billy the Kid, continued to ride, never leaving New Mexico. He was caught in Fort Sumner by the sheriff Pat Garrett and killed. Sources report that he was unarmed and shot in the dark. He was buried with Charlie Bowdry at Old Fort Sumner. Advisors report that sometime later, an unidentified person snuck into the graveyard and chiseled an inscription. The epitaph read only one word: pals.
That's the voice of actor Kiefer Sutherland, who played Doc Scurlock as a sensitive young man who was a lover of poetry. But according to historian and author James B. Mills, that depiction was more creative license than the real-life Doc Scurlock.
For starters, Doc had no front teeth. His top front teeth were missing because they got shot out of his mouth in a shootout over a card game. And, Doc lost his teeth, the other guy lost his life. To be real about it, Doc Scurlock, I think he's primarily famous now because of Kiefer Sutherland in the Young Guns films. That's what did it. And the fact is, those films wouldn't have been made if it wasn't for Billy Bonney.
Now, if you'll recall, Scott Scurlock was actually related to Doc Scurlock, who was one of the cowboys that rode with Billy the Kid.
You're talking about a time and place that was very much predicated on masculine individualism, and nobody wanted to take a backward step. Shootouts were extremely common, and I'm not defending Doc for some of the stuff he did, Billy was no saint, but back in those times, you had to defend yourself. You had to do what you could do. If you got accused of cheating in a card game, which is probably what caused Doc's teeth to get shot out, if you got accused of that, you got a shootout, it's going to turn into a fight. And everyone carried guns, 6-shooters, rifles. It was a very rough time. So I don't know if I'd say Doc was ever lured into crime. It was just more the time and place, and he was a product of his time and place and era.
Doc Scurlock and Billy the Kid joined the Regulators after Billy's employer, John Tunstall, was murdered by a rival posse. Their posse was called the Regulators, who sought revenge for the murder of John Tunstall, which ultimately led to the Lincoln County War.
When Billy's employer, John Tunstall, was murdered by a conglomerate of Irish businessmen that were known as the House, Billy and another man who was played by Charlie Sheen in the film, Dick Brewer, he was the leader, and Doc and Doc's brother-in-law, Charlie Bowdry. They were actually brothers-in-law, and they married sisters by that point, and a bunch of other guys, there was 10 of them in all. They formed a vigilante group, and they called themselves the Regulators. The reason they had to do that was because the law, the sheriff, was very much aligned with the House and was probably, we don't have a written confession, but looking at the evidence we have, he was probably involved to some degree in Tunstall's murder. Even if he wasn't directly involved, he'd consented by silence. And so they formed a vigilante group and went on the warpath to kill the men that had been responsible for John Tunstall's murder. They knew they couldn't arrest them because if they turned them over to the sheriff, Sheriff Brady, they'd just get turned loose. And then the Lincoln County War stretched on for months, and a lot of men got shot back and forth, shootouts for months and months, until it all culminated in a 5-day siege in the town of Lincoln. Doc Scurlock rode with Billy for a little while, stealing some horses, and then eventually in 1879 he moved to Texas with his wife, and he went off and pretty much lived out the rest of his life pretty quietly, wouldn't talk about his past much, and he eventually died an old man in Eastland, Texas in 1929, where him and his wife had 10 children. So the scene in Young Guns 2 where Doc gets killed with Billy, that when he's riding with Billy, that's completely false. Doc left New Mexico and went to Texas and lived to be an old man.
Scott Scurlock, that was one of the movies that he watched over and over again, was Young Guns. But it's like this romanticizing Doc Scurlock as the hero.
The funny thing is, the film romanticizes Doc, but it actually demonizes Billy a bit. That's the amusing thing to me. Billy was the most well-liked outlaw who actually tried very hard on a number of occasions to get out of the outlaw life. He's probably the most well-liked outlaw I've ever read of. 95% of the people who knew him really loved him and liked him and spoke very positively of him. They said he was extremely polite. He wasn't really like Emilio Estevez. Now, he had a vengeful streak and he was very angry after Tunstall's murder. And he did shoot his share of men on the frontier, but he wasn't really that kind of moody, morose Emilio Estevez in the films. He was very fun-loving. Whenever I watch Young Guns now, I kind of laugh because Doc is portrayed as, it's just the total opposite in a way. Doc is more kind of affable when really it was the other way around. Doc was the rougher one. And Doc Scurlock during the Lincoln County War, and this is a little anecdote, what the kind of guy we're talking about, he tried to shoot William Brady had already been killed. The Regulators had shot him because they were fighting the war and took him out. Doc Scurlock tried to shoot William Brady's 14-year-old son, who had no involvement in the Lincoln County War whatsoever. That was just pure malice on his part. The boy's mother went to Fort Stanton and reported that to the U.S. Army, which is partly what led to the Army marching into Lincoln and fighting against the Regulators. So Doc played a part in that. Now, Doc denied it. He did write an affidavit. The question is, who do you believe? Was he telling the truth, or was the widow with the son who was supposedly shot at telling the truth? But
what stopped him from shooting the son?
He missed, as far as I know. He fired shots at him, but he missed from a distance, apparently. They were in a little side canyon, not far from the Brady home.
Was it here, watching Young Guns, that Scott began to see himself up on the silver screen? The hero of the Wild West. We know he was a thrill seeker and an adrenaline junkie. Watching Kiefer Sutherland portray his great-uncle Doc Scurlock as a thoughtful poet going against corrupted officials, that was an anti-hero that he couldn't get enough of.
There definitely was a sense of camaraderie, and they were fighting to take down these businessmen, fighting to take them down, and also fighting to avenge Tunstall's murder. Billy and Doc they didn't really get any money out of the fight. I'll put it that way. And Billy never robbed banks. He wasn't a bank robber, and Doc never robbed a bank.
But the one thing we know about Billy the Kid and Doc Scurlock is that they weren't in the regulators for the money, but to avenge their friend.
He didn't do the Scott Scurlock thing where he was trying to stick it to the system. I think that's how he saw it, from what I've read. Getting large amounts of money from the government. They were more, you got to remember, this is 1878. New Mexico wasn't even a state back then. And it was someone getting shot and stabbed in New Mexico for a variety of grudges. I mean, that was commonplace almost.
If you'll recall, from a very young age, Scott Scurlock loved Westerns. He identified with anti-heroes like Billy the Kid and his ancestor, Doc Scurlock, which is easy to understand because as a moviegoer, is there anything more satisfying than the vanquishing of a really spectacular villain? But even more satisfying is the emotional push-pull that comes when you complicate that dynamic of good and evil, when you merge bits of both and you have an even richer, more complicated anti-hero. Basically, they're flawed, but lovable, rascally, and when they're sincere, they don't mean to be bad, but they also don't really want to be good either. We can sympathize with them because often most of us are more closely related to the anti-hero than the villain or the actual hero.
It's kind of, there's levels to everything. Now, if I see someone trying to make a hero out of Ted Bundy, I'm going to call him an idiot. If I see someone saying, I think John Dillinger was kind of cool, I'm like, well, okay, yeah, he was a bank robber, but I mean, he wasn't a maniac. So there's levels to it. Now, the Frontier even, it had rapists and horrible, horrible people, but then you had guys like Billy Bonney, the Doc Holliday, other outlaws as well, Wild Bill Hickok, who shot a lot of men, shot a lot more than Billy Bonney did, but they weren't what you'd call necessarily evil human beings. So I think you have to have that. You have to have a sense of likability. Now, from what I read about Scott Scurlock, was he a criminal? Absolutely. Was he a bit juvenile in his outlook on life? To some degree, yeah, everything he did. But was he an evil person? Did he rape women? Did he go around murdering people for his own sick enjoyment? No. So I can see why he would sort of appeal maybe to some. I don't know. But I think it's, they call it the social bandit. And I think it's the same reason everybody loves pirates. Now, you watch Pirates of the Caribbean, okay? I mean, I like especially the first one. What is Jack Sparrow? Really, what is he? He's a pirate. He's a scallywag. He's a liar. He's a thief. And people love him for it. Mm-hmm. Because he represents that roguish, kind of outside society kind of thing, but he's not the worst guy either. So it's kind of like you get guys that are kind of bad guys, but they're not the worst guys, and they kind of tend to appeal to that rebellious streak that I think people have in them, the same way that some rock stars do. I mean, Jim Morrison, did some shit that if I saw him doing it, I'd be like, what are you thinking? But at the same time, he had a lot of people kind of, because he was such a rebel, really admired him. And I mean, I'm a fan of the Doors, and that goes down with other rock musicians, but I think it's kind of the appeal of the rebel. And it still goes back maybe to some degree in terms of society. It goes back to Brando in the Wild One. What are you rebelling against? What do you got? And I think that kind of broadens with Jimmy Dean and right up to Kurt Cobain.
Speaking of Kurt Cobain, less than a year after the movie Young Guns came out, Nirvana's debut album, Bleach, was released on the independent Seattle label Sub Pop Records in June of 1989. Something I talked about with James, who happens to be a huge fan of grunge music.
Well, you're going to be really impressed because I actually have an interview set up with, I don't know if you've heard of Sub Pop Records.
Of course I have.
Okay, all right. So anyway, the CEO, who's the same woman who played a joke on the New York Times and acted like
the lexicon of grunge.
Yes.
Yeah, that was hilarious.
We'll get into what the lexicon of grunge is later in the series, but first, an introduction.
My name's Megan Jasper, and I am Sub Pop CEO.
Now, you should know Megan didn't start out as the CEO.
The first time I came to Seattle was in March of 1989. I was on tour with Dinosaur Jr., and the band had a show at the Central Tavern in Pioneer Square with Tad and the Screaming Trees opening up that show.
As someone from the East Coast, the music scene in Seattle at that time left a huge impression on Megan.
On the East Coast, if you went to a show that was like a pretty exciting show to go to, you would walk in and there was sort of a stillness, and people would have their arms crossed. The body language was not open. It was pretty tight. And on coming to Seattle, it just felt so different. People were like expressive and drinking and laughing and having fun, and everything felt vibrant and exciting and sort of high energy.
6 months later, Megan packed up her bags and moved to Seattle. She had $700 in her pocket and a dream to work at Sub Pop Records.
I went to their office the day after I arrived. It was total mayhem. The chaos that was in that venue was in their office, because there were all of these pallets of LPs, records that had just come in, and their offices were small. So there were just records piled up in the middle of their space. There were papers everywhere. There were people buzzing around, running around. It was so impossible to understand what was happening in the office, except that there was a lot happening. That was the only obvious thing. And they said, it's a little bit chaotic right now. Can you come back tomorrow? So I went back that next day, and they asked me if I was willing to do an internship, which I absolutely was. So I sat on the floor and I took cat butt records. Those were the records that had just arrived. And I mailed cat butt records to every college station in the United States. And, at the time, even though it was an unpaid job, it felt like one of the best jobs I ever had. It was everything that I cared about. It was about music and connection and participating in this pretty amazing scene.
Megan was an intern for literally one day.
John and Bruce offered me a paid job being the receptionist, and they offered me that job after one day of interning. I was really excited. So I took the job. It paid me $5 an hour, which at that time was fantastic. The cost of living in Seattle was super low, especially compared to the East Coast. And I knew that I could make it work, and I did.
Back then, it was still really cheap to live in Seattle. The city was still recovering from a recession in the mid-1980s. And like Megan said, she was living the dream.
Sub Pop, Jonathan Poneman ended up signing Nirvana to Sub Pop, but I had the good fortune of working with them early in their career. And so Bleach had come out just months before I started at Sub Pop. And we worked closely with all of our bands, Nirvana included.
Well, what's interesting in one of the interviews I read is that Kurt Cobain, in addition to all the hats that you wore as a receptionist, you did a newsletter, and he was like upset that he wasn't a part of that.
The thing I loved about being the receptionist is that I got to do so many different things, not just answer phones, although I really did enjoy that. If I had extra time, I would work on a monthly newsletter. And that was sort of a creative outlet. I loved doing it. It was super fun. And people were calling, asking questions all the time. So I knew the information that people wanted. The newsletter would be sent out every month to all of the bands we worked with, a lot of our contacts, writers, radio stations, people in different music scenes throughout the country that just wanted to be in the loop, because the newsletter had tour dates and everything else. And we didn't have the web at that time. So I took all of that information and we mailed it to people's homes so that they would have it. And one day when the Nirvana guys were in the office, Kurt asked me why he wasn't getting the newsletter. And I know that he was getting it because I was the one putting the labels on the newsletter, but he was moving at that time. I feel like he moved 2 or 3 different times within like a 1 or 2 month time period. And so the newsletters were just going to a wrong address. And so he said, "You guys always lose my address." And I was thinking, I don't think we lose it. I think you're just moving all the time. But he said, "I'm going to write it on the wall just so that you have it and it's always here." And so he took a pen and right next to the receptionist's desk, he like wrote his address on Pear Street in Olympia. And it was kind of awesome. And I loved that he just knew that he could do that. And when we ended up moving, when we ended up moving our office and getting out of that space, which was kind of a heartbreaker because that office was customized in all of these weird ways with Kurt's like with his address on the wall, with the dwarves having come in, spray painting on our floor, "You owe us money." I mean, there were so many weird things in that office that told such a good story, and we knew it. So it was hard to leave. But when we did leave, Jonathan and I said, "Let's go get that piece of wall that has Kurt's address." And it was a little scary because it's plaster, it can just totally crumble. And so as we started to try to pull some of it like everything got crumbly. So we took mailing tape and we put it over at the address, and that kept it totally intact. And we removed a little chunk of the wall and had it framed. And it's my favorite thing that we have on the wall at Sub Pop hanging. We have so much original artwork and like posters that we've done, paintings that bands have made, but we have that chunk of wall. And I love that it's Kurt's address and his writing, but I also just love that it's a piece of that original building.
Protecting the historical artifacts of grunge is important to Eric Magnuson too. He's a writer and created a grunge tour in Seattle.
There were definitely spaces that the sort of squatters could move into. Belltown, where I spend most of the time when I lead people around and I talk about the grunge era, I talk about Belltown as it was. If you got to go back decades to like the 20s, 30s, 40s, when they're flattened out all of Belltown. Denny Hill is gone. And then like what goes in there? Well, for a long time, not much went in there. It was light industry and brick apartment buildings and reused businesses. And so on down the road, when it gets to the point of the artists move in, and the artists before the musicians moved in, 70s, 80s, and there were a lot of spaces that they could totally like break into the basement and figure out this is gonna be a good practice spot. And there were other parts of the city, the Gits, to kind of cycle back to that, when they came out from Ohio in '89, they squatted on a house up on Capitol Hill, the Rat House, that they used, eventually converted it into recording space, and it was punk parties. You know, Seattle for a long time, from the mid 80s, 85, the teen dance ordinance passed, which eliminated a fair amount of all ages club opportunities. So the whole thing went underground. It was DIY spaces. It was these sort of reclaimed, squatted houses that people were using, have a party in a warehouse, have a party in a house. You can never find a house that's not being used in Seattle now, or for the last, 15 plus years, 20 plus years. But back then, there were those basement spaces, those warehouse spaces, those houses. And yeah, I went to some U District shows that were insane. And it was like, does anybody live here? And oftentimes it was a matter of, well, sort of, or it's not a house being used right now.
On his historical walking tours throughout the city, Eric shares what it was like being part of the grunge music scene in Seattle.
So there was an immense amount of attention to Seattle. What is Seattle? And for me, I was expecting kind of what I found, which was frenzy. There was hype around the music scene, but it was still pretty accessible. But it was kind of what I was expecting, which once again was crazy, but accessible.
In the late 1980s, Seattle was still considered way off the beaten path, which attracted a lot of musicians.
For ages, I don't think I paid over $20 for a show. It was usually $10 or so covers. And a few years prior, you had these iconic shows that were $6 advance, $7 at the door kind of things, so that people pretty much from all walks, if they were wanting to scrutinize the listings, they could find a bar that was a cheap entry to go see an amazing band that would hopefully have some success on down the road. But there were so few bands that were successful that most of the time you were just seeing really skilled players that were part of the local scene. And there were hundreds of bands here.
And in those early days, it was a time when you could get so close to the stage, to the musicians that you loved, in an age of moshing in small, smoky, sweaty venues.
I had only been here a couple of weeks. I made some friends pretty quickly that had been living here for a while. The first show that I tell stories about going to was at Rock Candy, which was a relatively new club. It was definitely an opportunistic club. And I saw Afghan Wigs there. They're a Cincinnati band, but really big at the time. And it was a full show, but I was right up by the stage. I was with friends of mine that had been living in Seattle for quite a while. And they sort of knew, I followed in their slipstream, and it was a great show right up front. Greg Dooley was basically sweating on us. And, you know, from that point forward, the clubs that I spent a lot of time in, my favorite club was the Crocodile Cafe. And the Croc was and is a famous Seattle venue. Back then, you could get into the small performance space there for shows most nights of the week, but also just spending time in the back bar, where I had a friend who lived downtown Seattle. He was sort of a terminally unemployable writer, like many of my friends, and he would get there early for us, get us one of the back booths right up by the bar, and we just kind of watched the scene unfold in front of us any night that we were there. And, you know, it was a different time. The musicians were also spending a lot of time at the Croc. It was widely called the living room of the grunge era, and you could mingle without hopefully not being too much of a fanboy in people's faces. And it was really pretty fantastic in those moments when you were seeing music and out in the scene.
This obviously was before social media. So basically, to promote shows, a guy went around the city with a staple gun, clicking 1, 2, 3, 4 staples onto an electrical pole. That was the marketing, and of course, word of mouth.
The data of how many bands were milling about Seattle and how that changed from the late 80s to into the period of the real sort of commercial grunge explosion, 92, 93. You go from a couple of hundred bands to approaching 1,000 bands, and not all of them were worth seeing, but many of them were pretty amazing, and they were side projects and all kinds of super group sort of gatherings of talent that really it is overly romanticized now to say these bands were within arm's reach, but for a while they definitely were.
But there was a dark side to this incredible music scene.
If a place becomes known for something culturally interesting, there's only a few people that are sort of out front of the culture, the musicians on the stage. And around that, there's an entire ecosystem of stuff going on. And it's not just the people that run the venues, that manage places, that, serve drinks. It's the people that deal drugs that realize, if you're gonna look for a place to go and be opportunistically taken advantage, Seattle then was great for that. Excess was always a part of the life.
Megan Jasper.
Seattle was very small. So the people, especially the musicians, consisted of this pretty tight-knit group. Everybody knew everybody. There was a real positive friendliness, openness. It didn't feel, it felt really fresh and exciting. And at the same time, there wasn't a whole lot to do because there weren't tons of music venues, which is one of the reasons I think why we ended up having so many great bands, because when there's not a whole lot to do, because there wasn't a whole lot to do, I think a lot of bands kind of just went into practice spaces and they would spend time together just making music because that's what they did to be social. They would hang out with each other and just jam and write songs. And many of them ended up writing really great songs. So there was it was kind of this perfect recipe for exciting things to happen. But the flip side to that is when there's not a whole lot going on, it's also just easy to go out drinking or go to someone's house. And there were a lot of drugs going around at the time. Not everybody was doing drugs, just a lot of people were. It was common, and it certainly wasn't unusual. And I did learn pretty quickly to just keep my mouth shut and not be judgmental, because you just don't know what anybody's past or present is. And almost everybody was affected by someone who was doing drugs, meaning people, even if you weren't, or if you were, you may easily be in a situation where you had to act quickly or help somebody. So there was a lot of that going on. It was dark. And the other side to that, not even hard drugs, but there was so much drinking. And again, I can see how that would happen. This is a place where the days, it's not Alaska, but the days are really short in the wintertime. You don't get tons of sunlight. If you have a normal job, you're going to work and it's still dark. The daylight happens when you're at work, probably inside in an office building or a retail shop, and then you go home and it's dark again.
And something else was brewing: crime. In the early 1990s, Seattle was dubbed the bank robbery capital of the Northwest and was ranked in the top 5 in the nation for bank heists.
It's funny because that's also what I remember. I remember there just being such an unusual amount of bank robberies. And I do remember at one point also feeling hesitant to want to go into banks, although you just had to at that point.
This was a time when Seattle was changing from an economy built on timber and aerospace to a tech hub with Microsoft millionaires.
But I do think that was the beginning of the separation of people in Seattle. Seattle was getting a little bit more expensive at that time, but it was still really a very livable city. It was changing so much, but it was during that tech boom, and it was during that time when all of a sudden there was so much new money coming into Seattle. Seattle had been a city with only old money when I arrived, but all of a sudden there were Microsoft people who were doing really well. There were new .com businesses that were starting to do pretty well for themselves. And all of a sudden, and there were musicians who all of a sudden had a lot of money all at once. And then there were people who were struggling. It was just the beginning of something that's still happening today in the city, where just now that gap it's so wide. But I think that was the beginning of it right then and there.
Next time, on part 4 of Hollywood, the 1991 movie Point Break was released and would become the inspiration for wannabe bank robbers. At the time, the screenwriter had no idea the impact his focus on capturing male bonding would have on a generation of young men.
I lost my father at a very young age, 8, and was raised by my mother, and I had 2 older sisters, and they left the house soon after. So I was raised with a grieving mother, and so my male friends were always very important to me. And young men seek role models. So I've just always been a guy who's developed a close relationship with friends, and with male friends. It's a very powerful connection, as I'm sure the sisterhood thing is for you ladies. But for us guys, to have someone we can trust, watch your back, and so yeah, the Utah Bodie thing was a bromance. Two guys are really cut from the same cloth, but they are on opposite sides of a badge, and so that makes a great little dilemma to play with.
And stick around, because up next we have Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host Brandon Morgan and I will discuss the case in more detail. And as always, thanks for listening. From Pie in the Sky Media, Criminal Mischief is an EVO production, recorded live in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. For EVO Creative, I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.